This is my true story. I worked my entire life to build something my family could be proud of, a business, a home, a legacy. I thought loyalty and love would protect it after I was gone. But I was wrong. One day, I learned that my own children had cut me out of my will. They took everything I built and erased my name from my own story. I didn't fight them, not yet. I had one last move left, one they didn't see coming. Before I tell you what I did, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. And please subscribe so my story can reach more people. I spent 50 years of my life building everything my family had. From the first brick of our small house to the large business that carried our name, every bit of it was built through sweat, sacrifice, and sleepless nights. I thought my children would be proud of me, proud to carry what I started. But the day the lawyer handed me the updated documents, everything I believed about family shattered. It started small. Meetings behind closed doors, quiet conversations that stopped when I walked into the room, papers they asked me to sign for routine updates. I didn't think much of it. I trusted them. They were my blood, my own. When my eldest son told me I needed to rest more, to let them handle things, I saw it as love, not control. I thought they were looking out for me, not pushing me aside. Then one morning, I received a letter from the law firm that had handled my estate for years. They requested a signature verification. It was strange, but I went in anyway. The lawyer looked at me with hesitation before showing me the updated version of my will. My name was still on the first page, but only as the testator, not as the beneficiary. Every asset, every property, every company share had been reassigned. My signature was there, but I knew instantly. I never signed that page. My hands trembled as I looked at it. The lawyer said he assumed I had approved the changes since my children had submitted the paperwork together. They had claimed I wanted to transfer control early, for convenience. I couldn't speak. I just nodded and left. Outside, the world felt different. Colder. Smaller. I sat in the car for an hour, staring at the paper in my hands, realizing what had just happened. My children, the same ones I carried on my shoulders, the ones I fed when I went hungry, had erased me from my own legacy. That night, I didn't say a word. I sat at the dinner table, watching them talk about money, travel, business plans, all funded by the empire I built. They laughed, called me old man, told me to relax. They thought they had won. They thought I was too weak, too tired to fight back. But I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was heartbroken. Anger fades, but heartbreak sits quietly, waiting for a moment to act. I spent the next few days pretending everything was fine. I smiled when they joked. I listened when they talked about future plans. But behind those smiles, my mind was working. I started remembering every time they told me to trust them, every time they said, "Don't worry about the details." I had ignored the warnings, the hidden tension, the impatience in their voices whenever I asked questions. I had mistaken manipulation for care. The betrayal wasn't just about the money. It was about what it meant. That love, in their eyes, had conditions. That I was useful only as long as I provided. The moment I stopped, I became an obstacle. They didn't even have the decency to wait until I was gone. They wanted me out while I was still alive, a ghost watching strangers divide what I built. I sat in my study that night and went through every old photo, every letter, every document. For the first time in my life, I felt completely alone. The family I built didn't exist anymore. It was just people. People wearing familiar faces, speaking words I no longer trusted. But even then, I didn't let bitterness win. I knew what I had to do. If they wanted to cut me off, I would let them believe they had succeeded. But the final say, that would still be mine. I would make sure that when I was gone, they would finally understand what they had done. They took my will from me, but they couldn't take my voice, not yet. The realization didn't come all at once. It crept in slowly, like water seeping through cracks until everything inside was soaked in truth. I replayed every moment of the past few years, every meeting, every signature, every time they smiled at me while quietly taking control of my life. It wasn't just one of them. It was all of them. My son, my daughter, even my eldest grandson who worked in the company. They had all been part of it. The plan wasn't spontaneous. It was careful, deliberate, and patient. They called it taking responsibility. They said it was for my health, for my peace of mind, but all of it was a lie. I remembered the day my daughter brought me forms to sign, telling me they were for business continuity. I had signed them because I trusted her handwriting more than my own. I didn't read the fine print. I couldn't have imagined that those signatures were the start of my own disappearance. I was handing away not just assets but identity, everything I had worked for. After I saw the forged documents, I began to test them quietly. I asked small questions, things I already knew the answers to. How are the company finances? Did we finalize the deal with the supplier? They responded with vague answers or changed the topic. They had built a wall around me, emotional and financial, and every word they said now sounded rehearsed. The hardest part wasn't the betrayal itself. It was realizing that I had ignored the signs. My wife had warned me years ago before she passed. She once said, "When people start treating you like a child, be careful. They're preparing to take your place." I had laughed at the time, proud of our family, believing love was stronger than greed. But now, sitting in the quiet of my study, I understood what she meant. I began to look deeper into the accounts, using old passwords they didn't think I remembered. My suspicions were confirmed. My personal savings were drained. Properties were transferred for tax purposes. The company board had been rearranged with my children in executive positions, my name reduced to founder, retired. I had become a guest in the empire I built. Every dollar they earned now came from my signature, the one they forged. But even in that moment of clarity, I didn't shout, I didn't accuse. I had learned that silence can be more powerful than confrontation. I began keeping records of everything: dates, copies, letters, notes from meetings. I wasn't planning to fight in court. I was planning something far greater. I wanted truth to outlive me. I wanted them to face what they had done, not while I was alive, but when I could no longer defend myself. That was the only way they would listen, when the guilt had no one left to argue with. At night, I lay awake wondering how love could turn into greed so easily. Was it my fault for giving them too much? Did I raise them to believe that money mattered more than respect? Or was it human nature, to forget the hands that built your foundation once you stand taller than them? Those questions haunted me, but they also gave me purpose. The more I thought about it, the clearer my next step became. I realized that if they could erase me from my own will, then I could rewrite my story from the grave. I would leave behind something they couldn't edit or destroy. They could take my wealth, but they couldn't take my words. That became my mission, to use my last act as a father not for revenge, but for justice. To leave a message that would pierce through their greed and expose the truth they buried. So I called my lawyer again. Not the one they knew. My old friend. The one who handled my earliest contracts. The man I trusted more than anyone left alive. I told him everything. He didn't interrupt, didn't pity me. He just said, "We'll make this right." That day, the plan began. They thought they had silenced me forever, but they didn't realize that sometimes the loudest voice a man has is the one he leaves behind. After I discovered what they had done, I said nothing. Silence became my weapon and my protection. I pretended everything was fine. I smiled at breakfast, nodded during their meetings, listened to their plans for the future they thought no longer included me. I let them believe they had won. I had learned that when people think they've taken everything from you, they stop watching closely. That's when you can move freely. Every night, I sat at the dining table surrounded by the same people who had betrayed me. They talked about profits, new houses, vacations, and investments. They laughed loudly, so sure of themselves. I looked at each of them and remembered the children they once were. The ones who ran to me when they fell, who cried for my comfort, who promised they'd never leave me. Now, those faces looked unfamiliar. Their eyes were full of greed, not love. But I didn't argue. I didn't even let my voice rise. I realized the most powerful man in the room isn't the one who speaks the loudest. It's the one who listens quietly while everyone else reveals who they truly are. Days turned into weeks. My silence began to bother them. They started asking questions, small ones at first. Are you feeling okay? You've been quiet lately. I gave the same answer every time. Just tired. They smiled, pretending to care, but I could see the guilt flicker behind their eyes. They didn't know if I had found out, and that uncertainty made them uneasy. I wanted that. I wanted them to wonder if I knew, because that fear was my only leverage. I began spending more time alone, mostly in my study. They assumed I was slipping further into old age. They couldn't imagine that I was preparing something that would outlive all of us. Every letter I wrote, every file I opened, every page I signed had a purpose. I rewrote my story in silence, one sentence at a time. The hardest part of those quiet days wasn't the betrayal itself. It was pretending not to care. I would lie awake at night staring at the ceiling, wondering where I went wrong. How did love turn into calculation? How did my children become strangers? There was no clear answer. Maybe I gave them too much too soon. Maybe I confused comfort with care. But I refused to let my grief turn into hatred. Hatred is loud, revenge is messy. I wanted neither. I wanted justice, quiet, clean, undeniable. So, I listened more and spoke less. I noticed things I had ignored before. How they checked the mail before I could. How they kept my phone out of reach. How they had already started dividing my possessions while I was still breathing. They underestimated me because of my age. They thought an old man's silence meant weakness. They didn't understand that silence, in truth, can be the sound of strength. Even my grandchildren noticed something was different. They asked why I didn't join the family dinners anymore. I told them I was working on something important. And I was. I spent my nights writing the letter that would one day be read aloud when I was gone. The letter that would make every one of them realize what they'd done. I wasn't angry as I wrote it. I was calm, even peaceful. I wanted my words to strike not through anger, but through truth. The more I kept quiet, the more careless they became. They stopped hiding their greed. They spoke openly about what they'd do when I was gone. They didn't realize I was still there, watching, remembering. Every laugh at my expense, every whispered plan, every stolen signature, I carried it all like ammunition. My silence wasn't surrender, it was patience. Looking back now, that period of silence was my turning point. It taught me that sometimes you don't need to fight to win. You just need to wait until the right moment to speak. I knew that moment would come one day, when the lawyer read my final letter. That would be the day my silence ended and theirs began. Once I accepted the truth, my silence turned into strategy. I knew I couldn't undo what they had already done, but I could decide how the story would end. They took my name off the will, but they couldn't take away my right to write. And that's exactly what I decided to use. My words. They had played their game in the light of greed. I would play mine in the quiet of reason. The plan began with one simple step. I met my old lawyer, the only one I trusted. He had been retired for years, but agreed to see me when he heard my voice on the phone. I told him everything. How my children made me sign papers without explanation. How they had my signatures forged. How they slowly took over my company and home. He listened without interrupting, just taking notes. When I finished, he said something that stayed with me. You can't take it back, but you can decide what they inherit. That single sentence became my motivation. I started documenting everything, every act of deceit, every transaction I discovered, every letter with their handwriting pretending to be mine. I wanted the truth written down, not for court, but for history. I knew the day would come when the lawyer would gather them all in a room, and my words would finally have their turn. My life had been about building, not breaking. But sometimes the only way to protect what you built is to destroy what's rotten inside of it. I spent weeks rewriting my will from scratch. This time, I didn't name any of them as beneficiaries, not one. Every penny I earned, every property deed, every share of the business, I reassigned all of it. I gave part to charity, part to my loyal staff who stayed through the hard times, and part to the orphanage my wife and I had supported quietly for years. People who knew struggle would now get the fruit of my struggle. It felt right. But I didn't stop there. I wrote a letter, my final one. Not angry, not cruel, but clear. I wrote it in my own handwriting, signed it in front of 2 witnesses, and sealed it in a folder marked, "To be opened only upon my death." The letter started with love. I wanted them to remember that once there was love. Then came the truth. I described everything they had done, the documents they changed, the accounts they drained, the way they spoke about me like I was already dead. I didn't exaggerate or accuse, I simply told the story as it happened. I wanted my words to cut not through anger, but through shame. As I wrote, I realized the plan wasn't about revenge. It was about justice, about making sure that the values I lived by didn't die with me. My children thought they had secured their future through deceit, but I was giving them something they didn't expect, a mirror, one that would show them who they had become. I made sure everything was legal and sealed properly. The lawyer double-checked each document. He said, "When they hear this, they'll never forget it." I told him I didn't want them to forget. I wanted them to remember me not as the weak old man they manipulated, but as the father who outsmarted them in silence. When I left the law office that day, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: peace. I knew my time was coming soon, and that didn't scare me anymore. Because now, when I would finally close my eyes, I'd know that the truth would open theirs. They might inherit my silence while I lived, but they would inherit my voice when I was gone. From that day forward, I stopped pretending. I stopped chasing their attention or affection. I lived quietly, watched the seasons change, and waited. My plan was simple, but it carried the weight of everything I'd ever believed, that justice may move slowly, but it always arrives. And when it does, it doesn't knock. It enters with silence and leaves with truth. Once the plan was complete, I had to make sure everything was airtight. I knew my children, smart, careful, manipulative. If they even suspected I had changed anything, they would try to interfere again. So I built layers of protection around my will and my final letter, the same way I once built the walls of our family home. Strong, simple, and impossible to break without leaving marks. I started by setting up multiple safes and document boxes. One held the legal paperwork, another the recordings and copies of my statements. I kept them in places no one would think to check. Old drawers, unused lockers, hidden folders inside my office desk. My lawyer had duplicates of everything, sealed under his firm's authority. Even if they tried to challenge it, the law would side with the evidence. This time, I wasn't trusting emotions. I was trusting facts. Next, I updated all my accounts, closed the ones they knew about, and opened new ones in different branches. I moved my savings quietly, not large sums that would draw attention, but steady amounts over weeks. To anyone watching, it looked like normal financial activity. But in truth, I was preparing the final pieces of a puzzle that only I could solve. Every weekend, I would visit the orphanage my wife and I built years ago. I met with the head caretaker and explained my intentions in simple terms. When the time comes, this place will never have to worry again. Their eyes filled with gratitude, but I asked them for one promise: silence. They didn't need to know why, only that it mattered deeply to me. The setup wasn't just about money, it was about message. I wanted the moment of truth to hit with precision. I wrote instructions for my lawyer, how the letter should be read, who should be present, even the order of their names when he looked them in the eye. He promised me it would be done exactly as written. The day I signed that letter, I felt something lift off my shoulders. It was like releasing years of disappointment, anger, and pain into something that finally had purpose. Still, I played my role at home. I acted forgetful when they asked about documents, confused when they spoke about finances. I nodded when they discussed taking care of things. I let them think they were in full control. They didn't realize that every moment they underestimated me made my setup even stronger. They were too busy planning their future to notice I was rewriting their ending. At night, I'd sit in my study and stare at the framed photo of my family, my wife's gentle face, my children's young smiles, before greed, before deceit. I wondered what she would say if she could see them now. But deep inside, I believed she would have approved of what I was doing. This wasn't vengeance, it was correction, a way to restore the balance they destroyed. I also left something extra for them, a trail. Small hints in the house, small reminders of my presence, a few old notebooks, a few dated letters, a few photos with messages written on the back. I wanted them to remember that the man they dismissed as weak was the one who built everything they had. And when the lawyer's reading day came, I wanted that realization to break them, not because I wanted their pain, but because I wanted their truth. The final part of the setup was emotional. I forgave them, not out loud, but in my heart. Because carrying bitterness would have poisoned the purity of what I was doing. I wasn't punishing them. I was freeing myself. The will and the letter weren't acts of revenge. They were acts of closure. My silence had built the plan. Now, my faith would complete it. By the time everything was arranged, I slept better. I stopped fearing death. I knew that one day, when my time came, they would sit in that cold office, expecting wealth, and instead receive the truth. And that truth would echo in every corner of their lives, not shouted, not screamed, but read calmly by a lawyer's voice, carrying the power of a father who refused to be erased. The day arrived quietly, just as I knew it would. I was long gone by then, but everything was already in motion. My lawyer followed my instructions exactly. The family received letters calling them to the office, my children, their spouses, even my grandchildren. They believed it was a simple will reading, a formality before claiming what they thought belonged to them. None of them knew that the will they created was never the one that would be opened that day. They came dressed for victory. Suits, smiles, false sorrow. They probably practiced their faces in the mirror that morning, pretending grief for a man they had already erased years ago. The lawyer told me later how they greeted each other cheerfully, whispering about properties and accounts, guessing who would get what. They didn't shed a tear. They were too busy planning the future they believed I had built for them. When everyone was seated, the lawyer opened the folder marked with my name. My letter was inside, sealed with the same wax I used the night I finished writing it. He looked around the room, made sure they were ready, and said, "This is a personal statement from your father, written in his own hand." He requested it be read before the official documents. The laughter faded. The air turned still. He began reading. The first words were soft. To my family. I wanted them to hear love first, because that's how I lived. I wrote about our home, the days we shared, the lessons I tried to teach them. I thanked them for the memories we once had before greed took over. For a moment they smiled. They thought it was going to be a sentimental farewell. Then the next line came, and silence filled the room. I wrote, "I know what you did." The lawyer said their faces changed instantly. They glanced at each other, confused, nervous. He continued reading, word by word. I described how they forged my signatures, how they changed documents behind my back, how they took control of everything while pretending to protect me. I listed the accounts, the dates, the exact details of their betrayal. Every fact was correct. Every detail was undeniable. I wanted them to feel what I felt, not anger, but realization. I wanted the truth to wrap around them so tightly they couldn't escape it. As the lawyer read, some of them began to shift in their chairs. Others stared at the floor. No one spoke. My words had turned into their silence. Then came the part they didn't expect, the part about the will. I wrote, "You removed me from my own legacy, but you could never remove the values I built it on. You wanted wealth. I wanted meaning. That is why everything you plan to take has been given elsewhere." The lawyer paused, then read the list of beneficiaries. The orphanage, the workers, the old staff, the families who once served ours. Every person they had ignored would now receive what they tried to steal. By the time the letter ended, no one was smiling. My eldest son tried to speak but couldn't. My daughter cried quietly. Their spouses sat frozen. My grandchildren looked lost, too young to understand how greed had undone their parents. The lawyer closed the letter and said, "Your father's wishes are legally binding. The estate has already been transferred. That was the moment I had waited for. Not revenge, not victory, just truth. For years, they thought my silence meant weakness. That day, they learned silence can also be strength. I had given them everything in life: food, shelter, opportunity. And in the end, I gave them one final lesson. You can inherit money, but you cannot inherit integrity. The lawyer told me later that when they left his office, no one spoke to each other. They walked out separately, as strangers. The empire they wanted had vanished, and in its place was only guilt. That was my last gift, not to hurt them, but to make them see themselves clearly, maybe for the first time. That day, even though I was gone, I finally won. Not through anger, but through truth. Not through power, but through peace. The reading of the letter was unlike anything they had ever experienced. The lawyer told me later that even the sound of paper turning felt heavy in that room. My words filled the silence like thunder without a storm. Every sentence had weight because it came from a man they thought could no longer speak for himself. They came expecting signatures and property divisions, but instead they were forced to listen, not to a will, but to the truth. I had written the letter so the lawyer would read it slowly, line by line, leaving enough time for each word to settle. I wanted every pause to feel like a mirror. The letter started softly, as if I was still the same gentle father they once knew. But as it went on, the tone shifted, not out of anger, but out of disappointment that carried more power than rage ever could. I wanted them to remember every lie they told, and every time they looked into my eyes pretending love while plotting behind my back. The lawyer read about the documents they made me sign under false pretenses, the accounts they moved without consent, the business shares they claimed were theirs. I had documented everything and attached proof, page after page. They couldn't deny it. Each line turned their pride into shame, their smirks into still faces. They had built their greed on a fragile foundation of deceit, and that foundation was now cracking in front of them. The lawyer said my youngest son tried to interrupt, but the lawyer stopped him, reminding him that these were my last words, and they deserved to be heard in full. The room went silent again. I had written about loyalty, about how blood without love means nothing. I reminded them how I stayed up working through sickness just to pay their school fees, how I mortgaged our land so they could have the life I never had. And then I told them how it all ended, how the same hands I fed were the ones that erased me from my own legacy. I had asked the lawyer to read one specific part twice. You may inherit my blood, but you will never inherit my character. That was the line I wanted to echo long after the reading ended. I didn't want to hurt them, but I wanted them to face the truth they had buried under greed and comfort. For years, they thought silence meant weakness. That day, silence became justice. Then came the moment they had been waiting for, the distribution of assets. The lawyer opened the second envelope, the one containing the real will. He explained that everything had been reassigned before my death. Every account closed, every property legally transferred to others. My family expected numbers and deeds. What they received was a list of names they didn't recognize: workers, drivers, caretakers, and the orphanage children who used to smile when they visited. These were the people who had stood by me when my family turned their backs. When the lawyer finished, no one spoke. My eldest daughter began to cry quietly, tears not of grief, but of realization. My sons looked pale, lost, as if the ground had shifted under their feet. Their spouses whispered in panic, asking if there was any way to challenge it. The lawyer said the will was sealed, notarized, and beyond contest. My plan had been foolproof. The reading ended with the last paragraph, my farewell. I wrote, "If you ever wonder why I did this, remember that love cannot live in a house built on betrayal. You took my name from the will, but I took my heart from your inheritance." The lawyer said the room fell completely silent. Some bowed their heads, others simply stared at the floor. They had won on paper once, but they lost in truth forever. That day, the world didn't end for them, but it changed. They left that office not as a family, but as strangers tied together by guilt. My words stayed behind, echoing in the lawyer's office long after they had gone. I wasn't there to see it, but I knew it. I could almost feel the silence, the kind that speaks louder than shouting. When the lawyer reached the section I titled "The Words That Remain," the air in the room changed completely. These were the lines I wrote in the quiet of my final nights, knowing they would be the last time my voice would ever reach them. I didn't fill them with anger. I filled them with truth, plain, sharp, and unforgettable. Every sentence carried the weight of years they could never erase. I wanted my words to live longer than the wealth they chased. I began by reminding them where we came from. I described the first home I built with my hands, the small room where we all once slept together when there was barely enough money for food. I reminded them how we used to share laughter, how we leaned on each other, how we promised that success would never make us strangers. I wanted them to remember the beginning before greed turned that promise into dust. Then I told them what I saw as the years went by, how kindness turned into calculation, how love turned into obligation, how they slowly stopped visiting unless they needed something. I wrote, "I was not blind. I saw the way you looked at my hands when I could no longer sign checks fast enough. I saw the way you whispered when you thought I could not hear. You thought my silence meant I didn't understand. But silence is not weakness. Silence is memory." I explained how the betrayal didn't come from losing money. It came from losing the people I loved most. Money was always replaceable. Family was not. I told them I forgave them, but forgiveness did not mean forgetting. I wanted them to understand that I left this world not as a bitter man, but as a man who refused to let lies define his legacy. The lawyer said he paused as he read the next part because even he could feel the pain behind those lines. I had written, "You removed me from my own will, but you cannot remove me from your conscience. When you close your eyes at night, you will hear my voice, not angry, not cruel, but disappointed, because disappointment is heavier than hate." After that, I turned to the ones who still had time to learn, my grandchildren. I told them not to repeat the mistakes of their parents. I wrote, "If you ever wonder what destroyed this family, remember it was not poverty, not failure, not bad luck. It was greed. Greed is the quiet thief that steals love before it steals anything else." I asked the lawyer to make sure those words were read clearly because they were not meant to punish but to teach. I ended the section with the truth they never expected to hear, that the wealth they had betrayed me for was already gone. Every dollar had been donated, every property transferred to causes that would outlive us all. I didn't want my name to be attached to greed. I wanted it to stand for something pure. I wanted children I'd never meet to eat because of my hard work, for strangers to sleep under roofs my money built. That, to me, was real inheritance. The lawyer told me later that by the time he reached the last line, no one was looking at him anymore. My eldest son had his head in his hands. My daughter stared blankly at the floor. Their spouses avoided each other's eyes. The grandchildren sat in silence, confused, but listening. My words had done what years of speaking could not. They had made them see. I closed that section of the letter with a single sentence I wanted burned into their memory. Family is not about who you share a name with. It's about who stands with you when your name means nothing. That line was my farewell, a truth they could neither buy nor escape. It was the one thing I left behind that couldn't be taken from them. After the reading ended, the lawyer folded the letter carefully, as if it were something sacred. He said no one moved for several minutes. The sound of my voice on paper lingered long after the room fell silent. My words were no longer mine. They had become their mirror. The reaction to the letter was everything I expected, and more. The lawyer told me later that when he finished reading, the room stayed completely still. You could hear the ticking of the clock against the wall. No one moved. No one breathed. For the first time in years, they didn't have control. They couldn't buy their way out, talk their way through, or pretend they didn't understand. The truth sat in front of them like a mirror, showing every face that had turned away from me. My eldest son was the first to break. He slammed his hand on the table, shouting that it couldn't be real. He demanded to see the papers, the signatures, the witnesses. The lawyer simply pointed to the folder and said everything was legal, filed, and final. My daughter tried to calm him, but her hands shook too much. The truth was too clear. For years they believed they had manipulated me into signing away my legacy. They thought I was old, fragile, and blind. But I had been watching all along. My second son leaned back in his chair, quiet but pale. He had been the smartest one, the one who drafted the changes, the one who thought he understood every law. Now he realized that while he was busy deceiving, I was quietly undoing his plan. The irony must have hit him hard. The lawyer reading out loud the very words that proved he had lost everything he thought he'd secured. He didn't argue. He just stared at the floor, as if the ground beneath him had vanished. My daughter-in-law whispered, asking if there was still something left for the family. The lawyer told her no. Every cent had been distributed according to my final wish. She started crying, not for me, but for the lifestyle that had just disappeared. The mansion, the cars, the business, all gone in a few pages. I imagined her tears, not of guilt, but of loss for things that were never really hers. The grandchildren sat in confusion, too young to understand betrayal, but old enough to feel shame. One of them, my youngest grandson, asked if I had left them nothing at all. The lawyer said I had, but not money. I left them education. I had paid for their college funds separately years ago, secured under a trust no one could touch. I made sure the next generation still had a chance to live right, even if their parents had failed. When the lawyer read that part, the children looked relieved. Their parents, on the other hand, looked smaller than they ever had. The lawyer continued to explain that my house staff, who had served faithfully for decades, now owned their homes. The workers who built my business were now shareholders. The orphanage received enough funding to last 10 years. That was the part that hurt my children most. Not because they hated charity, but because they finally realized who had truly earned my loyalty. The people they considered servants were the ones who had stayed loyal until the end. Anger soon turned into silence. My eldest daughter buried her face in her hands, whispering that she was sorry. The lawyer said her voice cracked halfway through, like she wanted to cry but couldn't. The others didn't respond. Sorry was too late. Regret had no power once the truth was already written and sealed. When the reading was over, the lawyer stood and handed each of them a sealed envelope. Inside was a single page, a copy of the line I had written just for them. Family without loyalty is just strangers with matching last names. That was the only thing I wanted them to keep. Something simple, something they couldn't spend. They left the office one by one. No one spoke to each other. No one looked back. The lawyer said it was the quietest ending he had ever seen. That day, the inheritance they expected turned to ashes, and all they had left was a room full of silence and guilt. That silence was my justice. I didn't need to raise my voice, or fight in court, or prove anything anymore. The truth had done its work, and in the end, that truth echoed louder than any revenge ever could. When the lawyer told me later how that day ended, I realized my story had finally closed the way it was meant to. I had lived my life believing that love and loyalty could never be bought or sold, but in the end, I learned they could be tested. And that test had revealed everything. My children had taken my trust and tried to turn it into a contract. But when they tried to erase me, they only erased themselves. What remained was not wealth, but a truth that would outlive all of us. I wanted my legacy to be something that breathed, not something locked inside walls or safes. That is why I left it to the people who understood what hard work and gratitude meant. The driver who stayed up through my hospital nights. The housekeeper who brought food when I was too weak to move. The factory workers who never stole a single tool, even when no one was watching. Those were my family, not by blood, but by loyalty. They inherited not just money, but dignity. The orphanage I funded became the heart of my legacy. I asked the lawyer to visit it after everything was done. When he arrived, the children were laughing, eating, and studying under a new roof paid for by the fortune my own blood tried to steal. That moment meant more than any mansion ever could. I imagined those children growing up to build lives of honesty. the kind of life I once dreamed my family would have. The world would eventually forget my name, but it would not forget what my name built. My grandchildren someday would hear stories about an old man who left his fortune to strangers. They might feel anger or shame, but one day, they would also understand. They would see that the real inheritance wasn't money. It was the lesson that greed always loses in the end. The lawyer told me he kept one photo from the day of the will reading, the room filled with silence, my children sitting apart, unable to look at one another. That silence was my last gift to them, the kind of silence that forces reflection. Maybe, years from now, they will look at that memory and finally understand the cost of betrayal. I don't hate them. I stopped hating long ago. Hate chains you to the same people who hurt you. Forgiveness doesn't mean letting them back in. It just means setting yourself free. That's what I did. I left in peace, not bitterness. I didn't want revenge. I wanted truth to speak when I no longer could. And it did. My letter became my voice after death, and my silence became the echo they could never ignore. My house now belongs to the foundation that shelters families with no roof. My business continues to run under the workers who helped me build it from the ground. Every corner of my past now gives life to others. That is my peace. That is my justice. They cut me off from my own will, but they couldn't cut me off from the legacy I chose. They took my name off the paper, but I wrote it back into the world. And that, to me, was the greatest victory. Not that I took something from them, but that I gave everything to those who deserved it. If anyone ever hears my story, I want them to remember one thing. Don't wait until death to speak the truth. Don't wait until betrayal to value loyalty. Write your own ending while you still can. Because family may fail you, but your choices will never lie. And when the lawyer closed my file that day, he told me one last thing. He said, "Sir, your family left with empty hands, but your words filled every heart that heard them." That is how I want to be remembered, not as a man who lost everything, but as one who gave everything meaning.